Well, good evening, Naval War College. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the International Lecture sponsored by the Naval War College Foundation in the memory of Edgar W.B. Fairchild, a former Foundation trustee. It is always a wonderful occasion to see assembled in Spruance Auditorium so many friends of the college, students, and faculty. This evening, it is a great honor for me to introduce Professor John Lewis Gaddis. Professor Gaddis holds a distinguished chair at Yale University, serving as the Robert A. Lovett Professor of History. At Yale, he also serves as director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. Within the community of scholars, Professor Gaddis is held in high esteem, and he received the distinction of being awarded the National Humanitarian Medal by the President of the United States in the White House. Professor Gaddis is a noted teacher, known for the support and attention he gives to his students. At Yale, his undergraduate teaching, presenting innovative and popular courses on the history of the Cold War, on biography, and on grand strategy has won him many awards. His dedication as a teacher is also demonstrated by the notable successes achieved by his students. Under his guidance, a new generation of academic leaders is making their mark at colleges and universities around the world, including right here at the Naval War College. Professor Gaddis is the author of numerous books and articles listed in your program. His work is essential reading for anyone interested in the history of the Cold War, international history, and American foreign relations. For example, his classic work, Strategies of Containment, is required reading in the senior level strategy and policy course here at the college. Professor Gaddis' forthcoming biography of George Kennan, scheduled for publication early next month, is eagerly awaited. I understand there's copies this week. Tonight, he will talk about this major study on Kennan and the formulation and execution of America's grand strategy during the Cold War. Finally, let me say this, that Professor Gaddis is no stranger to the college. He taught on the faculty in the Strategy and Policy Department at the time when Admiral Stansfield Turner revitalized the curriculum at the college. Indeed, he dedicated his landmark study, Strategies of Containment, to his teaching team partners. I know some of you have seen it or will see it. Here's the actual book he wrote. For Wendell P.C. Morgenthaler, Jr., Colonel USMC retired, and Alan T. Isaacson, Captain U.S. Navy, Strategy Seminars, 1975-1977, U.S. Naval War College. It's in a multiple edition, one of his best-selling books. Over the years, he has returned to the college to give lectures and take part in workshops in support of our teaching courses on strategy. There is thus a close bond between Professor Gaddis and the Naval War College. The bond we share is the common ideal and mission of educating a new generation of leaders. A former congressman recently asked me how many of our graduates could hold their own in a conversation on strategy with General George Marshall. Well, thanks to our distinguished speaker tonight, the answer is they all should be able to. And to those of us fortunate enough to be here tonight, we certainly will be better prepared to think and talk about strategy at the highest levels. Join me then in giving a warm welcome back to the Naval War College to our friend and former colleague, John Lewis Gaddis.
Thank you, sir. Mm-hmm. Admiral Christensen, Professor Maurer, Foundation members, students, friends of the Naval War College, and wherever he is, newly appointed Professor Charles Adele. Where are you, Charlie? Thank you. It's nice to be back. It's nice to be back to a place that I owe a great deal to. I first lectured from this very platform, I believe, 37 years ago. The layout was similar. The auditorium has been remodeled. Everything is a lot spiffier than it was then, but nonetheless, the position was the same. I was, at that point, only recently out of graduate school. I was teaching at a little-known place, not Yale University, a little-known place known as Ohio University. And I received an invitation to lecture at the Naval War College under strange circumstances. I had delivered a paper, I think it was my first paper and my last paper ever, at an annual meeting of the American Political Science Association. And there was a little man in a trench coat in the back of the room, a gray little man who was taking notes. And this turned out to be James E. King, Jr., who was a secret agent for Admiral Stansfield Turner. And Jim King was the talent scout for Admiral Turner. And so on the basis of whatever it was that Jim wrote down about what I said at the APSA, I was invited to come here, to stand here, and to give a lecture on the origins of the Cold War. This was a little bit daunting because Stan Turner was sitting exactly where Admiral Christensen is sitting right now, in the front row. And even more daunting was what happened after the talk, because as I finished, Admiral Turner bounded vigorously up on the stage, kind of pushed me aside, and he said, "Professor Gaddis was right on the following issues, but he was wrong on the following issues. But he was right on enough issues that the talk that he has just given will appear in the Naval War College Review." Well, that was news to me. And he said, and this was even more news to me, he will be invited to teach at the Naval War College next year. Well, this was an interesting situation because, first of all, I had never read Thucydides or Clausewitz or any of the great texts that I was obliged to teach at this institution. I was at least 5 years younger than everybody who would be in my class. I had had no military experience. All of my students, the American students, were just back from Vietnam. And so I was scrambling to stay ahead of my students. And I had, as the Admiral mentioned, referring to the dedication, my first teaching partner was Colonel Wendell P.C. Morgenthaler, USMC, a formidable guy who I believe had John 3 tours in Vietnam, I think by then, as I recall. Constantly chain smoking in the seminar, one cigarette after another, with a cloud of blue smoke over the seminar table. And Wendy's technique was to let me rattle on for about 20 minutes or so, and then he would say, "John, everything you have said up to this point," I think I won't repeat what he said, but he then went on, "This is the way I see it, and when I finish, all of you will see it that way too." Now, weirdly, we got along beautifully, and I loved the experience. Indeed, it's more than that. The experience changed my life because it did lead to this book, which continues to be used, I'm flattered to know, at the Naval War College, Strategies of Containment. And because one of the first readers of that book, still reading it in draft at that time, was George F. Kennan. And those of you who have read the book will know that there are 2 chapters on Kennan, chapters 2 and 3. And Kennan, to my surprise, liked the book. I actually started getting fan mail from George Kennan, handwritten letters. "You have understood my views better than anyone else ever has." And I wrote back and said, "Thank you very much." And then another letter like that came and said the same thing. And I wrote back equally and fervently, "Thank you very much." Another letter came. And it suddenly began to occur to me, was he angling for a biography? It had never even occurred to me to do a biography in the first place. But I wrote and asked, "Is anybody doing your biography, sir?" And he wrote back and said, "Oh, it had never occurred to him that anyone would ever wish to do his biography. But now that I had mentioned it, perhaps we should talk about it." Later, as I got into the papers, I found little notes from 1948, 49, 50, clipped to documents that said, they started out, to the biographer, you should pay particular attention to this. So we settled in 1982 on an arrangement, which in effect meant that I would become Kennan's Boswell. It would be a relationship to Kennan like that of James Boswell to Dr. Samuel Johnson. I would be the authorized biographer. I would have total access to him, to his contemporaries, to his friends, to his papers. And the biography would be published posthumously, and he would never read it. And it turned out we both wanted this arrangement. The only problem turned out to be that I was Kennan's Boswell longer than Boswell was Johnson's Boswell, because George was 78 when we made this deal in 1982. And as many of you know, he lived to be 101. He did not die until the year 2005. Now, what this meant, this was a great embarrassment to George. He viewed it as a grave personal failing on his part. I would get phone calls from him, or I would go to see him, and he would say this, or I would get letters from him, a steady stream of these, in which he apologized profusely for continuing to live and thereby delaying the biography. It was a truly weird situation. So this is why the biography was in the works for so long, because I did not really want to start writing it until after his death, because I wanted to write it all at once, and so that's why it's now coming out. It took about 5 years to write. It should be out, probably copies this week, certainly officially next month. It's about an 800-page biography, so it is a doorstopper for sure. It's also a very, very different book from Strategies of Containment. I think it may surprise some of the people who have read Strategies over the years. Strategies really is a comparative study of the approaches to containment of successive American administrations. So it is, in a way, a theoretical book. Not heavily theoretical, but certainly it's the most theoretical book that I have ever written. Biography has to do something different. A theoretical work, a theoretical comparative work like Strategies, searches for consistencies. It searches for patterns over time. A biography has got to do something different. A biography has got to track contradictions, ambivalences. A biography feeds on incoherence and inconsistency. A biography is a narrative with all the messiness that implies. So while there was a coherent logic to Kennan's grand strategy, I think, which shows in Strategies of Containment, if you look at it from a very long, kind of remote, detached perspective. When you look at Kennan as a biographer, it's very different, and I think that you'll see that when the book comes out. I show the inconsistencies in Kennan's thinking about strategy from year to year, from month to month, from day to day. Sometimes it seemed from hour to hour to the people who worked for him. And this in turn meant looking at how Kennan's strategy was received within the US government, among allies, and as time went on, as an object of debate among public intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic. But a biography cannot be only about grand strategy. Even the biographer of a grand strategist has got to write about more than that. So this is a biography about all the other things Kennan was in his life. He was also a career Foreign Service officer, of course, a distinguished one. He was the first head of the policy planning staff. He was twice an ambassador to the Soviet Union and to Yugoslavia. He was also a historian. He was an early environmentalist. He was an adamant opponent of nuclear weapons. He was a constant critic of American culture. He was a farmer. He was a teacher. He was a poet, not a bad one, and one of the greatest writers, I think, one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. I mean this in a literary sense, not in a strategy sense. This shows up not just in his published books, of which there are many, perhaps almost 20 or so, But it shows up in his remarkable diary, which he began keeping in the year 1916 at the age of 12, and which he continued keeping with gaps through to the year 2003, just about a year or so before he died. Now, of course, there are gaps in it. It does not cover everything, but it's big enough to fill several thousand pages at the Mudd Library, the Mudd Manuscript Library at Princeton, where these papers are kept. Most of them handwritten, most of them written in a hand that did not even begin to become shaky until George was in his mid-90s, reflecting a mind that stayed clear all the way up until his last year of life. And what the diary shows, it seems to me, together with his voluminous correspondence, which fills some 300 archives boxes at the library at Princeton, what this shows is an extraordinarily complicated man. George Kennan was an insider who always felt himself to be on the outside. He was a patriot who loved his country but understood another country, Russia, much better than he did his own. He was an expert whose expertise was more often dismissed than drawn upon, or at least he felt that. I think it's true. He was an advisor whose advice seemed to be taken when it was most casually given, when he would just toss something off, and that would click, but the things that he spent vast amounts of time and effort on would be totally ignored. He was an alarmist about the Soviet Union who became an apologist for the Soviet Union. He was an enthusiast for covert operations. Indeed, he deserves probably the title of having, more than anyone else, invented covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. And yet, he came utterly to despise covert operations. He was a man whose marriage lasted 74 years, who was also a philanderer. He was a prophet who wound up being profoundly depressed by his own vindication. This is really strange stuff. And while arguably the most famous grand strategist of his age, he's a man who would much have preferred to have been known as himself a biographer of Anton Chekhov. Now, I'll come back to the reasons for that later on. But it does bring me to what I really want to talk about this evening. When you have written an 800-page biography, you cannot possibly talk about all aspects of it. The audience will immediately turn to pillars of salt, and this will hurt the sale of the book, so you have to be selective. So what I want to talk about tonight, because I think it's appropriate to this place, is Kennan's use of the classics. The strategy and policy curriculum here has long relied on the relevance of the classics, as do we in the Yale Grand Strategy program, which has been going for about 10 years, which is a shameless imitation of the strategy and policy curriculum here at the Naval War College. And it seems to me that this reliance on the classics that is common to both of our institutions and to an increasing number of other places that are teaching courses like this really rests on three assumptions. First, that the future is unpredictable. No big surprise there. Second, that the present is ephemeral. It passes so quickly that we can hardly grasp it. That therefore, the best you can do is to seek from the past what is timeless and therefore transferable, not with a view to prescribing any particular policy for the future, but rather as a way of increasing the chances that the policies you do decide upon when you confront circumstances that you can't foresee, increasing the chances that these will succeed. And I think that's why we read the classics, and I think that's why it's valuable to relate them to policy. Now, George Kennan believed much the same thing about the classical works. Take, for example, his most famous published article, which is the famous X article, Foreign Affairs, July 1947, on the sources of Soviet conduct, published anonymously, or at least he hoped. It contained citations, even within its brief space, both to Edward Gibbon and to Thomas Mann. And this, of course, was the tip-off that exposed the name of the author because, as his own secretary told me, nobody else in Washington would write an article for Foreign Affairs and cite Edward Gibbon and Thomas Mann. Only Kennan would do that, so it was a dead giveaway. What Kennan said was that the Kremlin leaders, this is in the sources of Soviet conduct, the Kremlin leaders in 1947 were finding it necessary, in Gibbon's phrase, to chastise the contumacy, the rebelliousness their own actions had generated. He went on to say, it is the undeniable privilege of every man to prove himself right in the thesis that the world is his enemy. For if he reiterates it frequently enough and makes it the background of his conduct, he is bound eventually to be right. So this came from Gibbon and the Roman Empire and the extent to which really any empire, because it conquers people who don't want to be conquered, who are going to resist being part of the empire, who resent being part of the empire, or will resent it with the passage of time. Empire carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. This was Gibbon's point. It sounds like Marx, but it comes from Gibbon, and it was used by Kennan in his X article. Even more striking was his use of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, the great first novel of Thomas Mann. Kennan used this as the basis for his famous prediction, which turned out to be right, in the end to be right, that the Soviet Union would in time hollow itself out from within. And so that country's fate, Kennan wrote, could well resemble that of the Buddenbrooks family in Mann's novel, a formidable external facade which conceals internal enfeeblement. In the light of distant stars, Kennan added, shines brightest on this world when in reality they have long ceased to exist. So Kennan thought it probable and said in this great article in 1947, quote, that Soviet power, like the capitalist world of its conception, bears within it the seeds of its own decay, and the sprouting of those seeds is well advanced. Therefore, the United States could enter, quote, with reasonable confidence upon a policy of firm containment designed to confront the Russians with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. And that big idea that the Soviet Union would, in time, destroy itself was, I think, arguably the most important grand strategic insight of the Cold War, one vindicated with eerie precision 4.5 decades after Kennan put it forward. So to see that far into the future, 4.5 decades, is pretty remarkable. Even more remarkable is the fact that it was Kennan's reading of two great books, both of which had been written before anybody had ever heard of the Soviet Union, Gibbon and Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, that provided the basis for the prediction. That's how the classics can be used to inform grand strategy. It's a classic example of the use of the classics. They provide meaning, as Thucydides famously said, meaning not just for their time, but for all time. And this is how it works. Now, I don't know when Kennan first read Thomas Mann, but I suspect strongly it was in the late 1920s, while he was still in his own 20s. He was stationed in Weimar, Germany, and in the Baltic states. He would have read it, of course, in the original German because he grew up in Milwaukee and spoke and read German very comfortably from the time he was a boy. I do know, because I asked him about it, when did he have time to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire? And George said that it was during World War II. It was the result of transatlantic air trips across the ocean in World War II. As some of you know, those planes had much shorter ranges than planes had now. They required frequent refueling, and of course, being military planes, diplomats did not usually have top priority on them. So it could take sometimes 2, 3, 4, or even 5 days to complete a trip across the Atlantic Ocean, stopping frequently. And because the planes were so noisy, it was impossible to talk. It was difficult even to sleep. And so the only solution was to bring along Edward Gibbon. And that's what Kennan did. And that's how he got through, certainly well into volume 3 of the modern library edition, which probably is book 6 of the original. All of which raises the question then of whether Kennan drew grand strategic insights from other classical works, and if so, what were they? Well, I regret to say to this audience, in fact, I'm profoundly depressed to say, that I know of no evidence that Kennan ever read Thucydides, at least with any care. This, in my opinion, is a great failing on Kennan's part. He really was not very interested in the ancient Greek classics. One of his best friends was the historian Louis Halley, who wrote a book, The Cold War as History, published in 1967, which used the Peloponnesian War as a kind of metaphor for the entire Cold War. But George admitted to Louis Halley that I really should have read more of the Greeks, but I don't know that he ever really did. General Marshall, cited in the Admiral's introduction, of course, said that every educated person should read Thucydides. So it's really very strange that George did not. I don't know why, for sure. I never really got a chance to ask him. Maybe the Greeks were too democratic for him. Perhaps the empire they ran, maybe they were too hedonistic for him. Maybe the empire they ran was too small and too temporary for him to see the analogies to his own time. But for whatever reason, I think he missed a lot that could have been useful to him, particularly in his later years as a critic of American grand strategy with respect to the Vietnam War. Although, in time, I think Kennan did get kind of the spirit of Thucydides vicariously through John Quincy Adams, who he greatly revered. And of course, John Quincy Adams would have read Thucydides in the original Greek. So somehow it got through in one way or another. It's also kind of interesting thinking about what preoccupies us today, that Kennan showed so little interest in and made so few efforts to gain access to the Chinese grand strategic tradition, now so carefully reconsidered by another great American grand strategist, Henry Kissinger, in this summer's excellent book on China. It's true that Kennan did anticipate the Sino-Soviet split 2 years before the communists took power. This would be 1947. But this was just reflecting the insights of his great friend and policy planning staff colleague John Peyton Davies, one of the old China hands in the State Department. Kennan himself knew very little about China and had very little interest in China. Clausewitz, however, I'm happy to say, was another matter entirely. Kennan, as far as I can tell, never read on war as carefully as he did the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And that may actually have been a good thing, because I think it induces schizophrenia to do a careful reading of On War. And this is because, of course, the book is incomplete. The book is badly integrated. We don't know what Clausewitz's final intentions were. And of course, it has also the liability of having been written in German. So of course, it's going to be hard to manage, even in translation, even in the best of translations, as I know you use here, Michael Howard, Peter Perret. What I tell my students at Yale, Clausewitz is nonetheless the centerpiece of our course, is that they have to back off and get a sense of Clausewitz as a whole. They have to back off and not do a close reading, but try to get the basic messages of Clausewitz, the main points. And that's what Kennan did. And fortunately for him, he was able to do it because he had a very elegant summary of Clausewitz to work with, still one of the best. This was by the German emigre historian Hans Rothfeld, and it came out in Edward Mead Earle's extraordinarily influential book, published in 1943, called Makers of Modern Strategy. This was an effort by some of the best historians in the country in the middle of the war to consider how the classical grand strategists could prepare American leaders for whatever role they were going to play. Obviously, it was going to be a big one in the post-war era. And the Clausewitz essay in Makers of Modern Strategy is one of the best in the book. Rothfeld's got Clausewitz right, unlike so many interpreters of Clausewitz over the years. And it was through Rothfeld that Kennan got Clausewitz. During a summer of crash reading, not unlike my first semester teaching at the Naval War College, for Kennan it was the summer of 1946. It was right after the long telegram from Moscow. He had been brought home. He had been put in charge of devising a strategy curriculum for the new National War College in Washington. And this is why he was doing Clausewitz, among other things. From Clausewitz, or from Clausewitz by way of Rothfeld's, Kennan took three great ideas. One was the now familiar Clausewitzian concept that war must be a continuation of policy by other means, that war cannot be conducted separately from or independently of policy. And this was, for many Americans, a new idea at the time. They had preferred to think of war as something separate from political considerations, to be pursued as vigorously as possible to the point of victory, at which point, but only at that point, would the politicians then take over. And the best example of this was the call for unconditional surrender, at least in Kennan's view, the call for the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan in World War II, an idea that Kennan thought was crazy because the resulting power vacuum would only pave the way for the domination of Eurasia by the Soviet Union, a wartime ally that he was sure was going to be a post-war adversary. Well, in fact, probably it's fair to say, most historians would say, the doctrine of unconditional surrender had greater grand strategic considerations behind it than Kennan realized. As his friend Chip Bolin repeatedly tried to remind him, how else could a democracy fight a great war other than by pursuing the goal of total victory? To try to persuade in a democracy that you should negotiate with the enemy, or you should negotiate with factions among the enemy, or something like that, just is not very easy to do. So it may be that FDR did know what he was doing, and Churchill, in making this call. But Kennan did find in Clausewitz very strong support for his argument, which he made in the long telegram and in many of his wartime dispatches, that the Soviet Union was Clausewitzian. The Soviet Union made no distinction between war and policy, and that if the United States was to deal realistically with the Soviet Union in the post-war era, it would have to do the same. It would have to see these as a continuum, not as separate entities. The second thing that Kennan took from Clausewitz, I think, was the idea that the purpose of military operations is not to produce as much violence as possible, but only to produce enough violence to make a psychological impression on the mind of the adversary, sufficient to cause the adversary to stop doing whatever it was that you objected to in the first place. And here Clausewitz was restating the very old idea of proportionality, which can be traced back through the American founding fathers. Hamilton says somewhere in the Federalist Papers that the means employed must be proportioned to the extent of the mischief. It goes back to Machiavelli. It goes back even as far as St. Augustine. This idea of proportionality resonated with Kennan, as with many others, not only because of the disproportionate effects of strategic bombing during World War II, but also because of the far greater violence that would now be possible in war if war was fought with atomic weapons. And so Clausewitz's concept in Book One of total or absolute war, from which the rest of his great book recoiled, actually came as close, I think, as anything before the nuclear age to anticipating the implications of the nuclear age, and I think Kennan saw that point and drew from it. Third, Kennan was impressed by what Clausewitz had written about the virtues of defense over offense, that every offensive in time exhausts itself. It reaches a culminating point, a center of gravity, at which only a minimal application of opposing force can then reverse the offensive. You just have to wait patiently, like General Kutuzov during Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, for that opportunity to appear. We used to have a premise when I was teaching here one of the very few ironclad, infallible laws of grand strategy: don't march to Moscow, especially in the winter. Maybe you still have it. We also used to have an analogy, which I think relates to this. It was the dog and car analogy. The premise was that dogs spend a fair amount of time chasing cars. They think a lot about chasing cars, but they never quite know what to do if they catch one, and that was Napoleon in Moscow. Both of these are useful principles to have in mind. Kennan's reading of Gibbon had persuaded him that the Soviet Union under Stalin had overextended itself by projecting its power, whether by territorial acquisitions or by the creation of spheres of influence, into the center of Europe. And so it had aroused what Gibbon called contumacy, rebelliousness. And there was nothing more difficult, Gibbon had written as a result, than to attempt to hold conquered provinces against the will of their inhabitants indefinitely. An empire, by this logic, could only be, in the long run, a source of weakness. So Stalin, in Kennan's view, in 1946-47, Stalin is the new Napoleon. He has taken control of half of Europe at the end of World War II, just as Napoleon took control of Moscow in 1812, or just as Hitler had conquered much of European Russia in 1941, 1942. But it's like the dog and the car. What do you do next? And there was no very good answer to that question. Kennan also drew from all of this, Clausewitz and Gibbon, the idea that a small push applied just at the right moment with carefully chosen means could reverse the momentum of Stalin's offensive and gradually force a retreat at relatively little cost to oneself. All the better if this could be done, if it could be pulled off with no fighting at all. And of course, Kennan's instrument of reversal turned out to be the Marshall Plan of 1947, which was intended precisely to produce a psychological effect in the minds of the Europeans to convince them that their future was not invariably Soviet domination, and the minds of Stalin himself to convince him that Europe was not going to collapse economically and therefore provide a breeding ground for communism to take hold in the first place. All that was necessary to get this going was for General Marshall to make a speech at Harvard in June of 1940. The speech alone reversed the momentum, and then the follow-through on that. It was a Kutuzov-like maneuver, waiting for just the right point of overextension, and Stalin never recovered from it. He was completely thrown off base by this, and he never regained the initiative in Europe. Now, Clausewitz, of course, knew something about 1812 because he had served in the Russian army in 1812. He even makes a cameo appearance in Tolstoy's great novel, War and Peace. It's somewhere along about page 774 of the wonderful New Purveyor and Volokhonsky translation of War and Peace. And just all of a sudden, Clausewitz comes riding by, making comments about strategy, very much to the disgust of Prince Andrei, who is not fond of Prussians, even if they are fighting for the Russians. Kennan, of course, knew Tolstoy very well, as he did the other great works of pre-revolutionary Russian literature. Indeed, it was through those works, those pre-revolutionary works, that Kennan had educated himself as a young Foreign Service officer, educated himself about the nature of post-revolutionary Russia, the Soviet Union. Kennan's great mentor, the head of the State Department's Division of Eastern European Affairs, Robert F. Kelly, had insisted on this in the training of the first group of young Soviet specialists. Chip Bolin was another of them who went through that training in the late 1920s. That if you wanted to understand the Soviet Union, which had not even been recognized at this point by the United States, but it was unlikely to be. If you wanted to understand the Soviet Union, you had to immerse yourself in the historical and literary classics of the old Russian Empire, reading them, of course, not in translation, but in their original text. And that is how the young Kennan spent a good deal of the time that he spent while serving as a junior Foreign Service officer in the Baltic states and in Berlin between 1928 and 1931. He had plenty of time on his hands. He was learning the language, and he was also making himself a classically educated pre-revolutionary Russian literary gentleman in this period. But how, you might ask, how did writers like Pushkin or Turgenev or Gogol or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, and especially Chekhov, how did they shape Kennan's grand strategy in the Cold War? Well, I think, to paraphrase a more famous person than I, they offered a window into the Russian soul. And I think in that sense, this was very important, because what they suggested to Kennan was that the Soviet Union, for all of its power and pretensions, was an aberration. It was an excrescence on the body politic, the culture of Russia. It would not last. And I think there are many illustrations of why Kennan thought this, many anecdotes relating this, but the one that I like best comes in June 1945, when, just after the war had ended, George Kennan sent himself to Siberia. He had never been to Siberia, but of course his great ancestor, the first George Kennan, who wrote Siberia and the Exile System in the 1890s, had traveled all over Siberia. And so the younger Kennan was curious to see it. And so somehow he wangled with the Soviet government permission to simply get on the Trans-Siberian Express in Moscow and take it to the east. He is traveling alone, except for his KGB supervisors, of course, who were following him along. And it takes him 4 days just to get from Moscow to Novosibirsk, with the train stopping constantly. But this delights Kennan because it's an opportunity to mix with average Russians. And he visits some of the factories and steel mills in the Kuznetsk region. He sees Novosibirsk. He does all of that. And then he flies back on a kind of ancient Russian crate, probably a DC-3 copy or something like that, from Novosibirsk, and there are periodic stops for refueling, and there are long delays. And while on the flight from Novosibirsk, Kennan is seated next to a babushka who was not even literate. She could not read or write, but she could talk, he said, with the grace and elegance and shrewdness of the pre-literate. He didn't use the word illiterate, he used the word pre-literate to characterize her. And he virtually fell in love with her. And so he pulled out his copy of Tolstoy. I don't know which Tolstoy, but it was Tolstoy. And he began reading aloud to the babushka in his classical 19th century Tolstoyan Russian, and she fell in love with him, of course, immediately. And then they got to Omsk, and it was a hot day, and they were sitting under the wing of the plane, and he continued to read Tolstoy to the babushka, but everybody else on the plane gathered around and just stood there listening to this, because they had never heard Russian read that way, because they loved Tolstoy, because somehow Kennan's use of Tolstoy in this purely accidental setting was connecting with something deep in the Russian soul. And he was very moved by this, and I think it simply confirmed what a lot of his other impressions also confirmed, that communism did not fit Russia very well. So therein, it seems to me, lay Kennan's optimism that a strategy of containment in the post-World War II era could indeed work, that the choices were not just those of war, as some people thought, or appeasement, as other people thought, both equally unattractive options. There was a third way, which was to wait patiently for the organic forces of change within the Soviet Union to manifest themselves. Kennan best explained this idea as it happened in the first university lecture, as far as I can tell, that he ever gave. It was given at Yale on October the 1st, 1946. He actually spoke here on the same day and talked about Mahan and presence as a way of avoiding the need to fight a war. But at Yale, he surprised his audience, I'm sure, by devoting at least half of the lecture that he gave to Russian literature. He spoke of Dostoevsky's haunting novel, Demons, comparing the Bolsheviks to the nihilists of the 1870s who claimed to be acting in the interests of the people, but who had nothing to offer apart from pointless violence. He evoked the provincial governor in Gogol's Dead Souls, who suddenly has a change of heart and apologizes to all of his subordinates that he has offended. And Kennan retold Chekhov's short story, The New Villa, about a well-meaning owner of an estate who had tried to befriend its peasants, had gotten nowhere with them, had walked away sadly, but was followed by a sympathetic blacksmith. And he said, "Don't be offended, mistress," said Rodion, the blacksmith. "Wait a couple of years, and you can have the school, and you can have the roads, but not all at once. If you want to sow grain on that hill, first you have to clear it, and then you have to take all the stones off, and then you have to plow it up, and then you have to keep after it, and keep after it, and it's just the same with people. You have to keep after them, and keep after them, until you win them over." So people, Kennan was suggesting, could reshape even the most tyrannical of governments, but it would require patience. It would take time. It could not be done overnight. And circumstances, not sentimentality, would wind up shaping people. Now, therein, I think, lay the key to what the American strategy of containment was to be in Kennan's mind. To create the circumstances over time that would leave the leaders of the Soviet Union with no choice but to reshape their own country. Indeed, they would come to see it as in their own interest to reshape their own country. But like Chekhov's peasants, it would take time for this to happen. And why this particular connection to Chekhov? What was the appeal, never satisfied on George's part, of becoming Chekhov's biographer? I think maybe is that Chekhov is a very different kind of Russian writer from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and the others. He's a much more intimate writer, a much more self-contained writer, much more restrained. I think that appealed to George's personality. George was eloquent, but he is not an arm waver or a table pounder, and I think Chekhov appealed to him in that regard. But it was more than that. It must have been Chekhov's deep psychological insights, his ability to evoke a world in a phrase or a gesture, what actors and directors in the theater called subtext. I'm pretty sure it was something else. It was, I think, Kennan's loss of his mother when he was only 2 months old. She did not die in childbirth. She died of appendicitis, but he believed that for years that she had died in childbirth. He grew up motherless, or with a succession of other mothers, none of whom really was a mother to him. And I think this, more than anything else, explains this permanent sense of alienation on Kennan's part, of never being comfortable anywhere, always of being on the edge of profound despair. And my wife, Tony, and I saw this reflected very eloquently. About 4 years before George died, we went to see him in Princeton. And Tony is a theater director herself, and she's a Chekhovian. She's directed Chekhov, and we got to talking about Chekhov. And Kennan began talking about another Chekhov short story called The Steppe, which is about a little boy of 8 or 9 who is being sent off to school by his parents. He's being taken in a cart by peasants drawn by oxen. He's on top of the hay. And the trip is a long one, it being the Russian steppe. And so there is above him the great sky, and at night all of the stars, and the little boy does not understand why he's being sent or where he's going or anything. And as George, at age 99, was telling this story to us in his living room, the tears were rolling down his face. And I think from that you get some sense of importance of Chekhov to him. But I like to think, although I have no proof for this, so I don't say this in the biography, but I'll say it to you. I like to think that maybe the most important thing for George was Chekhov's garden in Yalta. If you've ever been to Yalta, Tony and I were there this summer, You're taken on tours of the great palaces, the Levadia Palace, where the Yalta Conference was held. But you also visit Chekhov's very modest house, which is on a cliffside that's there. It's a house he built in the last years of his life. He knew he was dying of tuberculosis when the house was finished. He knew that he would not inhabit it for very long, but he felt it very, very important to have a garden. And so he arranged the plantings very, very carefully, not in the rigorous way that they were, that the Levadia Palace gardens are arranged, but kind of haphazardly and yet not haphazardly, placed in relation to each other, interesting combinations of plants and trees and bushes and whatnot. And there is a photograph of Chekhov just about a year before he died that shows him in his garden with his plantings, still very small, coming up about to his knee or so. And he's standing there in his frock coat. And standing next to him is his pet crane, who was not really a pet. It was a wild crane, but it came back every year to visit Chekhov in Yalta, and then it flew off to God knows where, but it would come back, and the crane is there, and the bushes and the little trees are up at about the height of the crane, which is sticking its neck up in the photograph as well. George Kennan visited Yalta in 1937. And I like to think that the plants by then had grown at least to George's own height of 6'1" or 6'2", or maybe well beyond that. But of course, Chekhov had not lived to see that happen. All he did was to set them in motion, place them, and leave instructions for the gardeners. And then when Tony and I were there this last summer, the plants have grown up so that they provide an entire canopy over the place. It's a cool refuge in a hot, sometimes city if you're there in August. It's a wonderful, mystical, magical place. And you can feel Chekhov's presence there. Now, one of the most striking images in Kennan, in talking about containment, is a horticultural image. I think it's implied in the story of Rodion the blacksmith. It's explicit in some of the lectures that Kennan gave at the National War College, one or two that he gave here, that the way you have to think about strategy, the way you have to think about dealing with an adversary like the Soviet Union, is to create the circumstances in which its growth will take place. You would not want to resist its growth. You would not want to kill it. You would not want to destroy the plants. But you want to try to tease them to grow a little bit in this direction, or push them to grow a little bit in this direction. And if you do this over a long enough period of time, they will feel perfectly comfortable growing in that direction or this direction or what. And I think it was precisely that metaphor that really best articulates Kennan's concept of containment in the Cold War, and it comes from Chekhov. So what is it then that the classics do for us, and how do they relate to grand strategy? Let me just conclude with a couple of my own experiences separated by some 3.5 decades. One happened here, and this was my experience with my own students at this institution in 1975 for the first time, teaching Thucydides, because my students were all just back from Vietnam at that point. They didn't want to talk about it. It would be very difficult. It would have been impossible to organize an explicit seminar on the Vietnam War, although Turner was very interested in having the students come to grips with what had happened in Vietnam. But there were at that time no books on Vietnam, no good books to use, and it was far too touchy to bring it up in class and just say what went wrong in Vietnam. And so I'm convinced that this is one reason why Turner required all of us to read Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War without any explanation. And of course, when we got to the end of it, when we got to the Sicilian expedition, to this ill-fated expedition of the Athenian democracy, and to its own self-destruction as a result of this ill-conceived operation, when the parallels became evident. The effect was cathartic. I had students in tears in my seminar over the account of the Sicilian expedition. And while I never asked them why this moved them so much, I just took advantage of this teaching moment without ever mentioning Vietnam. Nobody needed to mention Vietnam, but the memory of this is just indelibly imprinted on my mind. My sense is that my students felt that they were not alone, that because of Thucydides, they could learn that someone else had once gone on a long, ill-conceived expedition. Someone else had had to cope with defeat. Someone else had had to think about how to recover from it, not very successfully in the case of Athens. The fact that it was a democracy that had gone through this in the so-called Athenian Golden Age was all the more tragic and moving, but at the same time, it was close enough to their own experience for them simply to feel that they had not been alone in the despair they felt and what they experienced in the Vietnam War. Okay, fast forward from that moment, which would have been the fall of 1975, to the first time that I taught my current freshman seminar at Yale, which several of us now regularly do, and I'm still doing it. But the first time I taught it was in the fall of 2008, and I decided to see what I could get away with the freshmen because they are innocent, they don't know any better, so I hit them with twice the normal reading load in a Yale seminar. And one of the things that I required them to read was War and Peace, every line of it, all 1,200 pages. They did not bat an eye. Now, finally, after this went on, I noticed that they were interested in the war parts of it, 1805 and later 1812 and whatnot. But they were actually more interested in the peace parts of it and had gotten caught up in the characters, and they started bringing the characters into our seminar discussions. So they would talk about Natasha and Prince Andrei, and especially Pierre. They would talk about Pierre. And this happened frequently enough that I got curious about it. Why were they so caught up in Tolstoy? Why were they so caught up in these characters? And one day I just asked them in class, and it was one of these spontaneous but treasured teaching moments, because I had 3 freshmen sitting on 3 sides of the table who said the same thing simultaneously. They said, because they make us feel less lonely. Now, Yale freshmen were confronting an unfamiliar environment, Yale. Vietnam vets were confronting an unfamiliar environment, which was the frustration of their country's military ambitions. 2 extremely different situations. But the classics were being used in both cases, somehow to make us feel less lonely. Yale students particularly are fond of the bumbler Pierre, because that's what they feel like when they come to Yale, and then they get beyond it. So that, I think, is what it's all about. That's why I think the classics are a foundation for the study of grand strategy, because they make all of us feel less lonely, because they provide examples that go way back into the past, because they give us a comparative base upon which to draw, and with that, we all grow a great deal. And I have grown a great deal as a result of my long contacts with this institution. I'm extraordinarily grateful to you, Admiral and John, for having me back, and grateful to you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. The Admiral has informed me that we have some time for questions, so the floor is open if anyone is so moved.
I have a question.
Yes.
One of the people you didn't mention tonight was Dulles. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what about the relationship between
That's right.
Kennan and
Could you
Dulles?
wave your arm? I can't see where you are. Good. Got you. Thank you. Go ahead, please. Dulles?
I mentioned Dulles, and I'm just wondering about the relationship between Dulles and Kennan, since you didn't mention him tonight.
It was not amicable. Basically, John Foster Dulles fired George Kennan from the State Department. This was after, however, George Kennan had been appointed ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1952, and within 5 months got himself declared persona non grata through his own intemperate statements. That is one of the weirdest episodes in George Kennan's life, and I write about it at great length in the book. Dulles had campaigned on a platform of liberating the Eastern European satellites. Paradoxically, George had employed or advocated the employment of covert operations to do the same thing some 5 years before that, but now George had changed his position, and he feared that any overt efforts to try to achieve liberation would be far too dangerous given the nuclear presence in that period. And so there were great differences. But it's also characteristic of George that one of the things he could never do very well was to gauge the effect of his own pronouncements on others. And so Kennan had given a speech in Scranton in, I think it's on January the 16th, 1953, in which he says that the strategy of liberation is far too dangerous and irresponsible. Now, this is 4 days before the Eisenhower administration takes office. This is 4 days before John Foster Dulles officially becomes Secretary of State. And yet Kennan is sitting by the phone waiting for John Foster Dulles to call him and to appoint him to something. And of course, the call, not surprisingly, the call does not come. So Kennan always was bitter about Dulles. Dulles, I think, was puzzled by Kennan, but of course Dulles was not the only person that was puzzled by Kennan. Washington was full of people who were puzzled by Kennan. So it was not an amicable relationship. Years later, as the documents began to open up, we learned a lot more about Dulles, and he turned out to be a far more sophisticated strategist than certainly Kennan thought. And I used to argue with George about this, and I would show him the documents, and he would sort of grudgingly say, "No," like that. But for him, John Foster Dulles never actually redeemed himself. What else? Yes?
Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Wallace, United States Air Force. You talked briefly about the relationship of the Russian people and communism with respect to the eventual mismatch and decline. With what you know now and looking forward, where do you see Russia and that people with respect to the government moving forward?
Well, I think here I would take a view not very different from what I think George would say in answering that question. He was always very skeptical of the idea of trying to impose blueprints from one country to another. He would be very skeptical of the idea that somehow the American concept of democracy would transfer to another culture. He really believes in the deep-rootedness of culture. And Russian culture, he would be the first to say, is very different from American culture. So I think it would not surprise him that democracy, as we understand it, has not taken hold in Russia. It certainly would not surprise him to learn that the Russian people seem to prefer strong leaders, what we would consider to border on authoritarian leaders. Not very surprising given what they went through in the 1990s. So I don't think there's much going on in Russia now that Kennan would find very surprising. In fact, there's a good deal going on in Russia now that he would find very reassuring. Look at the resurgence of religion, for example, which is extraordinarily powerful in Russia now. And he would have said, I could have told you that. Of course that's going to happen. So in that case, I think he would not be all that surprised by what's going on. Yes?
Commander Jorge Garcia, Navy. Sir, you made a very clear picture of how the classics of literature were important to who Kennan was and what he did for this country. Now, flash forward to today in China. I have to admit, I can't come up with classics of literature written by Chinese other than Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which we're all familiar with. Is that just my ignorance? What do you make of this?
you need to read Henry Kissinger's new book, which is quite an astonishing book. I think it may well be the most important book on grand strategy that's been published in the last decade. And this is saying something for somebody who is 88 years old. But where Kissinger starts that book, really, is by going back to the photographs of Nixon and Mao in Mao's study in 1972, and just asking the question, what was on all those bookshelves behind Mao? Remember that photograph? And then there are all kinds of books and things that are piled, stacked on the floor, whatever. What are they in the first place? They're not daily operational documents for running the government. Mao was not doing that at that point. What they are the great Chinese classical works. Now, are they explicitly grand strategies? Some of them are and some of them aren't. Some are simply great poems or great novels or whatever, but with grand strategic applications. And part of my point tonight is that literature, even though not specifically addressing grand strategy, can have grand strategic implications. It certainly did for Kennan. So Kissinger begins the book by pointing out that only in China, if you go to negotiate with an official at any level of the government, only in China would those officials have in their head, immediately accessible, something like 4,000 years of a grand strategic tradition, very little of which has been translated into English. And whether that's true or not, certainly there is a deep-rooted respect for history, and you can refer, just as casually as we might refer to a presidential administration of 25 or 50 years ago, they will refer to an emperor 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and the presence is just as close. So there's something there that is, Kissinger thinks, extraordinarily important if you want to understand China. And I agree with him. I think that that is the case. Let me just give you one example of this. In 1974, Mao gave an interview to his favorite journalist, Edgar Snow. And he said something very cryptic that puzzled everybody. Snow had congratulated Mao for having changed China. And Mao said modestly, "Oh, I've only changed a few things in the neighborhood of Beijing." And then Mao went on to say, "I'm just an old monk with a leaky umbrella." That's it. That's all he said. Of course, that was reported back to the CIA, and the CIA kicked it around, and all the China specialists kicked it around, tried to figure out what the hell does it mean. Kissinger discusses it in his memoirs, says it remains one of the most cryptic and enigmatic of Mao's statements. It remained enigmatic and cryptic right up to the time that he was writing this new book on China. But as it turned out, his research assistant for this new book on China is one of our grand strategy students, one of our former grand strategy students. Charlie knows him, an American fluent in Chinese who was able to really go through the untranslated Chinese grand strategic classics and at least compress them or abridge them or in some way summarize them for Kissinger. So the first 100 pages or so of that book are a kind of introduction to this previously neglected Chinese grand strategic tradition because so little of this material has actually been translated. Yeah. So what about the leaky umbrella? Well, it turns out to be a triple pun in Chinese. It can be taken literally to mean I am an old man with a leaky umbrella. It can also be taken to mean that I am a man with a bald head exposed to the elements. But it can also be taken to mean that I am an emperor subject to no law under the heavens. Now, which was it? Very good question. Probably Mao meant it to be all three, because what he loved to do was to confuse the barbarians, you see. And it's good to know that, right? There's something there that if we can begin to access it, if we can begin to get a sense of it, then perhaps we might be a little more better equipped to deal with China. So I do think that for some of the same reasons why the classics, the Western canon, is important in the study of grand strategy here and at Yale. So I also think that the Eastern canon, of which we know very little at this point, but I think it should be an agenda for the next 10 or 20 years to begin to access it, is important. And I'm heartened by the number of my students who are taking Chinese and will be able to read this in the original language. In fact, one of the strange things that happens with the Yale undergraduates is that you look around the seminar room, and about a third of the students are taking notes in Chinese. They may not be Chinese, but they're taking their notes in Chinese. And I think that's profoundly encouraging. I think it's very important, because I think it will give us access to this whole long tradition of which we know so little. Okay. Yes. Should this be the last? Well, we have a little bit of time. Maybe two more.
So Jonathan Walker from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm interested in seeing, would Mr. Kennan have drawn any parallels between the Cold War and the threat we face now from Islamic fascists?
Would he have drawn any parallels between the Cold War and the threat of Islamic fascism? I think, well, first of all, you have to realize that George Kennan also did not know anything about Islam or the Middle East, and didn't want to know anything about Islam or the Middle East. George is very much a northern latitude, cold weather person, and the third world was not his forte in any sense. So you have to start with that proposition. But I do think that he would have argued certainly against American efforts to come in and try to impose our system on those countries. There is one moment when he's flying to Moscow in 1944 and he has to fly a circuitous route, and he winds up in Baghdad and has to stay overnight, 2 or 3 nights, and there's an entry in his diary that what a horrible place this is, he says, but I'm sure that at some point in the future some American administration is going to decide that we have to come in and rebuild it or reconstruct it. And he says, and they will be sorry, he says. And that's all he says. That's 1944. You know. So that was his. He did not really take on board the implications of 9/11. By the time that happened, he is really not writing very much. We talked a little bit about it, but it was not something that really preoccupied him a great deal. But I think this is, I think to extrapolate, what he would have stressed is the deep-rooted character of national cultures and the difficulty of trying to change national cultures. And this really gets back to John Quincy Adams. It gets back to this notion that the United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams famously said, and Kennan endlessly repeated that phrase. I think that whole sense that one has to respect cultures, even if one doesn't know very much about them, and one certainly should not take on the pretension of trying to change cultures, would be characteristic of Kennan. One other thing I think that's interesting about Kennan, he's very much kind of 19th century multipolar person in his view of the world. The whole notion of bipolarity as it developed during the Cold War made him intensely uncomfortable. He really is always trying to push back toward a multipolar system. It's partly because he distrusts the Soviet Union. It's as much because he distrusts the United States and what the United States might do with its great power, and he thought it healthy to have other balancing powers out there, whether it's a reunified Germany or whether it's an independent Japan or whatever it is. And I think that's part of the key to understanding his view of the third world too. He would look at it in balance of power terms. Terrorism, he really just never had a chance to come to grips with and had no clear thinking on, it seems to me. Yes, should we make this probably the final question?
Yes, Colonel Brown, I'm privileged to be one of the military professors with the civilians in the strategy department. I'd really be interested, Dr. Gaddis, in two comments that you might comment on. One is his relationship with NHTSA, who was both a peer and a rival, I guess, in terms of
Yes.
days of containment. The other one is recently, about a year ago, I picked up a copy of Kennan's memoirs. And I think at one time they were a bestseller. I think probably, and as you mentioned him as a writer, I'd like your comments. They seem to be underread at this point.
First, on the NHTSA-Kennan relationship. It was an interesting relationship in the sense that as Nick Thompson, who is NHTSA's grandson, who wrote the book about both of them, the double biography of The Hawk and the Dove, which came out about 3 years ago. And as Nick quite accurately says in that book, it was a very interesting relationship because even though they were close personal friends, each believed that the policies of the other, if implemented, would destroy the United States. And there's something to that. At the same time, I think it's possible to exaggerate the nature of the friendship. It was nothing like the close friendship that Kennan had with, for example, Charles Bolin. This was almost a brother relationship, despite the fact that they fought with each other constantly. With NHTSA, it's a more sporadic relationship, showing up at each other's birthday parties or family weddings or things like that, saying the appropriate things, reading the appropriate speeches, that kind of thing. But one of the things George says about NHTSA is very revealing. George, of course, read everything that anybody ever published about him, and he read it compulsively. And then he would either note it down in his diary or he would call me up and I would hear about it, mostly hear his complaints about it. And he was just furious with NHTSA, who wrote a few just kind of casual sketches of events that both of them were involved in. And NHTSA was not a great fact checker. You really cannot trust what he says because he gets dates wrong, stories wrong, and whatnot. This really drove George up the wall. George is a meticulous historian, meticulous on accuracy. So he says at one point, I really don't think Paul I don't think Paul knows me very well. And what that meant was that Paul had not bothered to do the research to pin down the details of what he was writing very well. And so that was an asymmetry in the relationship. NHTSA himself had a kind of a cool attitude really toward Kennan. It's very interesting in the Reagan years, particularly, because if you think about it, Ronald Reagan probably came closer to implementing the Kennan strategy and to really completing the Kennan strategy than any other American president. Reagan did not want to sustain the Cold War. He wanted to end the Cold War. He wanted to do it peacefully, but he wanted it to happen through change in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets would then themselves bring about. Reagan was the only nuclear abolitionist to ever be president of the United States, and of course that's what George Kennan was, also a nuclear abolitionist. And so you'd have thought that Kennan would be ecstatic to have somebody like Reagan in the White House, but not at all, far from it. Kennan thought that Reagan was the most dangerous of all the American presidents. And this was because, and this is typical of George, if you begin to jumble together all of these contradictions. First of all, Reagan was a Republican, strike against him. Secondly, he was from the Republican right wing. McCarthy had once lived there. Third, he was in show business and advertising, definitely a strike against him. Fourth, he uses belligerent rhetoric and is scaring the Russians, definitely a strike against him in this period. Fifth, he's doing SDI, which will destabilize the arms race, even though Kennan was not a fan of traditionally conceived arms control, but that was a strike against him. Sixth, he's from California. That is really a strike against him in Kennan's mind. So it's really tragic that it was like ships passing in the night in the sense that they would say the same things, they would believe the same things. The internal documents, NSC documents of the Reagan period could have been written by Kennan back in the 1940s. And it's interesting that so few people who knew them both tried to bring them together. Two people who did, one who tried hardest was Jack Matlock, who was the last American ambassador to the Soviet Union. and knew them both, of course. Worked for Reagan, but knew Kennan very well. George Shultz periodically would try to bring them together. Paul Nitze never did, for whatever reason. Maybe he knew George too well. Maybe he just didn't care. I don't know what the answer to this is, and it's not something that I've had a chance yet to ask Nick Thompson. But in some ways, Paul Nitze, who was working for Reagan pretty much all the way through, would have been the logical person to go to George and say, look what's going on here. He never did that, and it's very sad that that happened, because really George never clearly understood who Ronald Reagan was. And it was really because style was so important to George that style could blind him to, that's what I meant by being depressed by his own vindication. And indeed, he was just that. Okay?
What a wonderful evening, Professor. It's a real honor to have you back. We're very proud of you as a much younger man, and much younger than the students, as you said, that you started here. And we're equally proud today of two professors, Toshi Yoshihara, James Holmes. I don't know if they're here tonight, but they wrote this great book, Red Star of the Pacific. It reminded me a lot of your comments about studying Asian thought. But to Professor John Lewis Gaddis, from your shipmates at the Naval War College, welcome back. Thank you for your continued service to the Naval War College and to the nation.
Thank you,
you, sir.
Thank you.
Grab your notes. We hope this exit here stays right.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Drive safely. Good night.